Born on May 15, 1949, Harold Monroe was the only son of a World War II veteran living in Modesto, California. Harold's father, reflecting his wartime experiences, was the embodiment of a disciplined military man who ran his household with strict precision. He frequently recounted his time in the war, often telling Harold and the family about his battles against the Axis forces, emphasizing the sacrifices he made for their freedom. This upbringing instilled in Harold a worldview centered on loyalty, discipline, and martial values. Surprisingly, Harold grew up to be a well-adjusted teenager. Though his father was strict, he was neither abusive nor unkind. Harold developed strong social skills and was even voted most likely to succeed by his classmates at Patterson Valley High School. However, tragedy struck in 1967, just after Harold graduated. One of his closest friends, Brian, was killed in a car accident when a reckless drunk driver sped around a blind curve on a California highway and collided with him. The sudden loss devastated Harold. Within weeks of Brian's death, Harold constructed a shrine in his bedroom, including candles, a photo, and some of Brian's belongings. When Harold's girlfriend saw this, she was deeply unsettled. Mourning a loved one was understandable, but Harold's fixation seemed obsessive. Her concerns deepened when Harold confided that he feared he might be in love with Brian, suggesting the pain of loss was amplified by unspoken feelings. Whether this was true or not remains uncertain. Harold's depression drove a wedge between him and his girlfriend, and he turned to marijuana and LSD to cope. His experimentation with hallucinogens created further distance between the two, and they eventually broke up. By 1971, at just 22, Harold followed his family's advice and voluntarily admitted himself to a mental health facility to address his spiraling depression. However, his stays were short-lived. He moved between institutions without significant improvement and eventually abandoned professional help altogether. Without treatment, Harold's behavior worsened, and signs of paranoid schizophrenia began to surface. After being evicted from his Salinas apartment for disruptive behavior, including pounding on the floors and yelling at non-existent people, Harold found himself homeless. He attempted to join a seminary, but his erratic demeanor led church leaders to turn him away. In 1974, Harold, now 25, was arrested for vagrancy after an officer found him burning himself with a cigarette. Recognizing his inability to care for himself, Harold's parents took him back into their Stockton home, leading to a brief improvement in his condition. However, during this time, Harold developed a deranged worldview rooted in a dark obsession. Harold was born on May 15th, the same day as the infamous San Francisco earthquake of 1906. This event, with its 7.9 magnitude tremors, caused widespread devastation and thousands of deaths. Harold had read extensively about the disaster during his childhood, and it profoundly shaped his thinking. He became convinced that catastrophic earthquakes were the result of an ancient subterranean force demanding human sacrifices. He further believed that American wars somehow appeased this entity, preventing large-scale quakes. To support this belief, Harold meticulously charted earthquakes alongside major U.S. conflicts. He noted a lull in earthquakes during World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. In contrast, he pointed to the 1933 Long Beach earthquake, which occurred shortly after the U.S. withdrew from Nicaragua, as evidence of the connection. For Harold, these patterns confirmed his twisted theory. Without bloodshed, the ancient force would wreak havoc. Driven by this belief, Harold set out on a deadly mission. His initial plan was to join the U.S. Marine Corps to emulate his father's service and facilitate necessary sacrifices. Although he excelled in physical and mental tests, his admission was denied after he admitted to past drug use. This rejection deepened Harold's paranoia, and he became convinced of a conspiracy against him. In January 1975, Harold sought out an old friend, George Tanner, who he believed had sabotaged his life by introducing him to drugs. When Harold discovered George had moved, he went to the new occupants, a woman named Lisa Franklin and her 2 young children. After Lisa provided George's new address, Harold killed her and her sons, erasing potential witnesses. Harold then tracked down George and his wife, murdering them in their Santa Clara home. These murders were part of a broader spree. Harold killed several others, including a hitchhiker, a college student, and even a retired fisherman. He justified these acts as sacrifices to prevent earthquakes. His most notorious crime occurred in February 1975, when he killed a group of teenagers camping in Redwood State Park after accusing them of damaging the environment. Harold's killing spree ended when witnesses to one of his daylight murders reported his license plate to police. He was arrested without resistance and confessed, claiming his actions were necessary to prevent a catastrophic earthquake. During his trial, Harold was charged with multiple murders. Although his defense highlighted his schizophrenia, the jury found him guilty of several counts of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and remains incarcerated. Just days after Harold's arrest, a significant earthquake struck Southern California, causing widespread damage. For Harold, this event vindicated his delusions. Though widely regarded as a paranoid and violent individual, Harold's crimes continue to provoke unsettling questions about the coincidences he pointed to. I didn't grow up with much of a family. My mother passed away after being disowned by her parents, and my father spent most of his life shuffling in and out of mental health institutions before taking his own life. The only relative I knew of was my dad's brother, my uncle. One of the few dark truths I was aware of about my family was that my uncle carried guilt over my father's death. He'd cut himself off from the world, living alone in a cabin deep in the woods of northern Vermont. I had only a vague idea of where the place was and absolutely no interest in finding it. To me, he was as good as dead, like my parents. Honestly, I blamed him for my father's death, too. Focusing my anger on him gave me some sense of closure after a childhood filled with pain and loss. Against all odds, by the summer of 2017, I had built a decent life for myself near Burlington. I worked as an assistant manager at a local brewery, had a cozy apartment, and even managed to go on a few dates. I was moving on from my past, and it felt like a weight lifting from my shoulders. Then came the letter that changed everything. It was from a law office in Montpelier, Vermont. As soon as I saw the state postmark, I had a sinking feeling. The letter informed me that my uncle had passed away. The lawyer was handling his estate, dividing what little there was among surviving relatives. I'd always assumed my uncle didn't have much, and the letter confirmed that. Still, he had left something for me in his will. Annoyingly, I would have to travel to Montpelier to find out what it was. Curious but unwilling to drive, I called the lawyer and asked directly what I'd inherited. He explained that he didn't know. All he had was a key to a safety deposit box at a local bank, along with instructions to ensure I opened it and understood what was inside. His payment, it seemed, was also locked in the box. The situation felt like the premise of a bad thriller movie. But when the lawyer assured me this was serious, my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to make the trip. If there was something valuable, I wasn't going to leave it behind. On a warm Friday in mid-July, I took half a day off and made the drive to Montpelier. The Vermont countryside was beautiful in summer, but my anxiety about what awaited me gnawed at my nerves the entire way. At the lawyer's office, I met the man handling my uncle's affairs. We drove together to the local bank where the deposit box was held. My hands were clammy as we entered the vault. When I opened the box, I found only 2 items: a small stack of cash and a letter. The lawyer took the money, leaving the letter for me. But as I held it, I couldn't bring myself to read it. When the lawyer noticed my hesitation, I asked him to summarize it instead. He agreed. I watched as he opened the envelope and read its contents. His puzzled expression unnerved me. Finally, he handed me the letter. It wasn't an explanation, apology, or farewell. It contained only a set of coordinates and 3 cryptic words: "Burn it all." The lawyer asked me if the coordinates meant anything. I didn't know for sure, but a quick search on my phone revealed they pointed to a remote area near the Green Mountains. I guessed it was where my uncle's cabin was located, but what he wanted me to destroy, I had no idea. As unsettling as the situation was, my curiosity was hooked. What had my uncle been hiding? Was it illegal? Immoral? Whatever it was, I felt compelled to find out. The next morning, armed with a gas can and matches, I set out for the cabin. The closer I got, the more unnerving the forest became. Strange fungi dotted the landscape, grotesque, brain-like growths and red, bleeding mushrooms clung to the trees. The deeper I went, the more these bizarre fungi multiplied, creating an almost alien landscape. The smell of the cabin reached me before I saw it. A rancid, meaty odor mixed with rot. When I finally laid eyes on the structure, it was a decaying wreck, covered in the same weird fungi as the forest. Overwhelmed by the stench, I hesitated at the door, but my curiosity got the better of me. I stepped inside. The interior was worse than I imagined. The air was thick and humid like a sauna. Fungi grew everywhere. A large pot on the stove was filled with something foul, and tubes connected to it pumped vapor throughout the cabin. Books covered in mold were strewn across the floor. Strange symbols were scrawled on a chalkboard. The whole place felt like a cross between a scientist's lab and a nightmare. I could barely stand the smell and retreated outside, gagging. Determined to carry out my uncle's final request, I doused the cabin in gasoline and set it ablaze. As the flames consumed it, I swear I heard something, like a low, guttural scream. I drove home in silence, haunted by the experience. I'll never know what my uncle was doing in that cabin or why he wanted it destroyed. Maybe some secrets are better left buried. I've tried to move on. I have a stable life now and someone I love. But every now and then, I think about those mushrooms and that cabin in the woods. If you ever find yourself near the Green Mountains and start seeing those strange fungi, do yourself a favor, turn back. Born on May 20th, 1948, Harold Milton grew up as the only child of a World War II veteran in Modesto, California. Harold's father, embodying the archetype of a disciplined war hero, ran the household with military precision. He often shared stories of his service, emphasizing the sacrifices he made during the war, which he believed shielded his family from hardship. These tales profoundly shaped Harold's worldview, instilling in him values of loyalty, discipline, and a fascination with combat. Surprisingly, Harold developed into a sociable and successful young man. Though his father was strict, he was neither cruel nor harsh and ensured Harold learned the social skills that earned him the title of most likely to succeed at Central Valley High School. But in 1966, tragedy struck. One of Harold's closest friends, David, died in a car accident when a drunk driver sped around a blind curve on a rural Californian road. Devastated, Harold sank into a profound depression. Within weeks of David's passing, Harold created a shrine in his room. It featured candles, a photo of David from the yearbook, and personal mementos. When Harold's girlfriend saw this, she was disturbed. Mourning a friend was natural, but Harold's obsession seemed unsettling. Her fears deepened when Harold confided that he worried he might have been in love with David, which made the loss unbearably painful. This revelation strained their relationship. To cope, Harold turned to drugs, experimenting with marijuana and LSD in hopes of finding relief. These habits only widened the rift with his girlfriend, and they soon broke up. By 1970, at 22 years old, Harold checked himself into a psychiatric hospital at his family's urging. Though his stay was voluntary, Harold moved between facilities without much improvement, ultimately abandoning treatment. By 1971, Harold's behavior had deteriorated. He exhibited signs of paranoid schizophrenia, which alienated him from others. After a series of outbursts in his Salinas apartment, including yelling at imaginary people, he was evicted. Homeless, Harold attempted to join a religious seminary but was turned away due to his erratic behavior. Harold became increasingly obsessed with the idea of sacrifice and natural disasters. He fixated on the coincidence of his birthday, May 20th, with a major historical event, the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. This earthquake, with a magnitude of 7.9, caused devastating destruction, fires, and over 3,000 deaths. Harold believed that the quake was the work of an ancient subterranean entity demanding human sacrifices to prevent such disasters. Harold compiled a timeline of earthquakes and correlated them with U.S. wars, convinced that times of war reduced earthquake fatalities. This belief solidified his delusion that sacrifices, whether on battlefields or through his own actions, were necessary to appease this entity. In 1972, Harold, now 24, applied to join the Marines, intending to fulfill this imagined duty. Though he excelled in the tests, his admission was denied due to his drug use, further fueling his paranoia. His delusions escalated. Harold began targeting those he believed were aligned with the malevolent force he feared. In a series of killings in 1972 and early 1973, he murdered multiple individuals, including a former high school acquaintance, Jim Larson, and Jim's family. Harold justified these killings as necessary sacrifices. He committed more heinous acts, murdering strangers and mutilating their bodies. In one instance, he attacked a hitchhiker, claiming the man symbolized a biblical figure requiring sacrifice. Another victim, a college student, was stabbed and dismembered. Harold's most shocking act was the murder of a priest, whom he believed volunteered as a sacrifice. Despite his crimes, Harold occasionally displayed remorse. Witnesses reported seeing him at a church shortly before murdering the priest, suggesting an internal conflict. However, his actions showed premeditation and calculation. Harold's killing spree ended when police arrested him in early 1973 after a witness provided his license plate. In custody, Harold confessed, claiming his murders were to prevent earthquakes. Chillingly, California experienced no significant earthquakes during his killing spree. At his trial, the jury debated Harold's sanity. While his schizophrenia was undeniable, his ability to plan some of his murders suggested lucidity. He was convicted of multiple murders, receiving a life sentence. Despite several parole hearings, Harold remains imprisoned, his mental instability making his release unlikely. Eerily, shortly after Harold's arrest, California experienced a 5.8 magnitude earthquake, causing significant damage. This coincidence led some to wonder if Harold's delusions contained a kernel of truth. Though Harold's beliefs were rooted in madness, his story continues to provoke unsettling questions about coincidence, causality, and the mysteries of the earth. In the summer of 1976, the affluent Anderson family from the suburban town of Maplewood, near Detroit, spent their vacation at their lakefront cabin along Lake Superior, a short drive north of Pinehurst near the Straits of Mackinac. The couple, Tom and Margaret Anderson, had been married for nearly 2 decades and had built a comfortable life through their success in marketing and publishing. They raised 4 children together: 18-year-old Brian, 15-year-old Greg, 11-year-old Ryan, and 6-year-old Emma. To outsiders, the Andersons appeared to be the picture of a thriving, happy family, but behind closed doors lay a web of hidden troubles, some darker than others. Tom's publishing business, which had flourished in its early years, was now facing financial challenges. Unpaid bills were piling up, bank accounts showed erratic withdrawals, and investors were growing increasingly skeptical about Tom's ability to deliver returns. Compounding the strain, his office had seen a high turnover of assistants, with many leaving within months. Rumors swirled that Tom's inappropriate behavior made the workplace unbearable. Allegations included requests for female employees to lift their skirts under the guise of inspection, though his wife Margaret remained oblivious to these accusations. The Anderson family's vacation home, called Evergreen Lodge, was a picturesque log and stone cottage set off a winding road, a short distance from the shoreline. When they arrived in June, Margaret couldn't have imagined the horrific events that awaited them. About a month into their stay, the property's caretakers started receiving complaints from neighbors about a foul odor emanating from the cabin. Concerned, the caretaker went to investigate. The house was locked tight, and he initially assumed it was something as simple as spoiled food or a plumbing issue. But upon forcing his way inside, he was met with a nightmare that would scar him for life. The stench of decay overwhelmed him as he stepped into the sweltering house, where the heat was inexplicably cranked up despite the blazing July temperatures. In the living room, Margaret Anderson's decomposed body lay face down, partially covered with a plaid blanket, a gunshot wound to the head marking her death. Tom's body was found near a vent, having been shot with 2 different firearms, a small caliber pistol and a rifle, and his skull bore signs of blunt force trauma. The grisly scene left no doubt of the violence they had endured. The caretaker stumbled out, vomiting from the horror, and quickly alerted law enforcement. Police discovered young Ryan sprawled atop his father, killed by a single gunshot wound. Nearby lay Emma, her small body riddled with bullet wounds and a fractured skull. Upstairs, the 2 older Anderson children were found in a bedroom, both shot in the head. Brian also had a bullet wound in his back, suggesting he had tried to flee. Investigators pieced together a chilling sequence. The killer had likely fired through a window to incapacitate Tom before breaking into the house and hunting down the rest of the family. The intruder had been methodical, even attempting to conceal the scene by covering a broken window with cardboard and drawing the curtains. The oppressive heat, deliberately left on, accelerated decomposition, complicating the determination of the time of death. Despite the calculated nature of the crime, only a single set of footprints was discovered, pointing to a lone perpetrator. Neighbors recalled hearing gunshots in late June but dismissed them as hunters. The last people to see the Andersons alive were a tree service crew hired by Tom to trim branches around the property. Investigators initially focused on Tom's business dealings, suspecting an aggrieved associate. This led them to Frank Delgado, a 31-year-old former soldier who had worked closely with Tom for years. Delgado's financial records revealed he had been embezzling funds from the company, and further inquiry showed he had recently purchased firearms matching the calibers used in the murders. Delgado claimed to have given away one of the rifles, but a neighbor reported seeing it in his possession not long before the killings. Police searches uncovered shell casings at a firing range linked to Delgado's family, strengthening suspicions. Though Delgado failed 2 polygraph tests and acted suspiciously, prosecutors initially declined to charge him due to insufficient physical evidence, including the absence of the murder weapons. In 1973, as a renewed effort to prosecute Delgado gained traction, he took his own life, leaving behind a typed note in which he admitted to being dishonest in business dealings but vehemently denied involvement in the Anderson murders. The note read, "I am a fraud but not a killer. Forgive me." His death effectively ended active investigations, and the case was left unsolved. The brutal slaying of the Anderson family remains one of Michigan's most haunting mysteries. Though theories have abounded, no definitive answers have emerged. Friends and colleagues of Tom Anderson describe him as a devoted family man, unable to comprehend why anyone would want to destroy his family. To this day, the identity of the killer remains unknown, and the tragedy stands as a grim reminder of the darkness that sometimes lurks behind even the most idyllic facades.